with us is John Scheuring with a presentation entitled The Saguaro's Forgotten Companion Plant, the Foothills Palo Verde. And so John Scheuring has an MS from the University of Arizona in plant science, agronomy, and a PhD from Texas A&M University in plant breeding and genetics. He spent 8 years plant breeding field crops in West Africa with ICRISAT, the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. And then he followed that with 19 years as a research manager with Signeta, based at their headquarters in Basel, Switzerland. He's retired and now home in Tucson since 2005. And he's an active volunteer in land restoration work with the Bureau of Land Management and a volunteer right-of-way buffelgrass and fountain grass weed control with Pima County, the Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Forest Service. He's currently the chairman of the Arizona Native Plant Society's Conservation Committee. So thank you very much, John.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. The saguaro is the iconic plant of Arizona, but also the entire Southwest, the Sonoran Desert. And for Europeans, the saguaro is sometimes perceived as a symbol of the United States. But the saguaro certainly has visibility way beyond our borders. But what we forget is that where there are saguaros, there are companion plants, which most often are the Foothills Palo Verde. And I'd just simply like to speak this evening to raise awareness about this forgotten companion plant, but which is a very important species in the Sonora Desert. The Sonoran Desert's great amigos are the saguaro and the Foothill Palo Verde. And I say not Palo Verde, but Foothill Palo Verde. And the name Foothill is appropriate because its happiest home is on slopes. We have planted by seed thousands of plantings of Palo Verde, Foothill Palo Verde, at the Waterman Restoration Site. And what we find is that we have much more success of emergence and growth on slopes than on flat ground. They just are happier there, and just as saguaros are. The saguaros and the Palo Verdes are friends from birth to death. And of course, we know about the famous nurse tree story, whereby Palo Verdes, but there are also other trees that can be nurse trees, but the Palo Verde is far and away the most common nurse tree of the saguaro, as well as other cacti. And this association you see all over, all the way from just south of I-40, east of Kingman, all the way south to south of Navajoa in Mexico. The nurse trees, once they are not needed by the saguaros, often reach the end of their lifespan. And typically a Foothill Palo Verde has a life of 75 to 125 years, whereas the saguaros can go on to live upwards of 250 years. So very often, and most often, the saguaros outlive the nurse plant. Usually there are only 2 or 3 saguaros that survive over time from underneath a nurse plant. But in some cases where you have favorable soil moisture, you can have huge clusters of saguaros that survive and thrive to great heights, along with their Palo Verde nurse tree, especially when they're near rock outcrops that collect water, and the water is retained on shelves. The saguaro isn't the only cactus that is nursed by the Palo Verde. Here's a beautiful specimen of an organ pipe outlier on the eastern slopes of Ragged Top on Ironwood Forest. But there are about a dozen different columnar and various cacti in Arizona that are nursed under a Palo Verde. And very often, when you have a dense growth under a Palo Verde, you can spot 6 or 7 cacti species growing underneath the umbrage of the Palo Verde. So why has this association worked so well? And this association has worked, at least in recent times, since about 3000 BC here in Arizona, when the Saguaro came back in after the Ice Age. And this is known from the pack rat record. Palo Verdes were already back and established. But that association started way back then up to now. And over the eons, through lots of extreme weather, this association has worked. And why? For many reasons. And these are just a few. First of all, both of those species thrive on slopes of volcanic, granitic, and limestone origin. They are not, limited by one soil type or one rock type. They both have shallow and fracture penetrating roots that take up moisture from light rains and also subsurface reserves. Palo Verde is a legume and fixes nitrogen in the soil. And Palo Verde is strongly drought deciduous and drops abundant litter compounded over time. And this is probably the most important message of this evening, and we'll go into this in depth. The decaying litter increases water of the rainwater permeability into the soil. And the shade of the tree drops soil temperatures 10 to 25 degrees. And we've measured this with infrared thermometers. And by dropping the soil temperatures, they thereby reduce the surface evaporation and extend the moisture availability to young plants. And the litter protects young plants from animal soil disturbance, especially birds. Those of you who have grown saguaros from seed, you know that the first 2 years, the seed is the young plant is a very fragile thing. And the first manifestation of a plant actually just looks like a sticker, and it can be easily uprooted. And our towhees are lovely birds, but they are rapacious when it comes to surviving young germinating cacti. And so the litter often acts as a restraint, a cage, to keep these birds out and free from the growing young saguaros. But besides being nurse plants to plants, the Palo Verde is also nurse plant to 2 of the really prime desert birds, the verdin and the black-throated sparrow. The nests of the black-throated sparrow are typically very low. The literature says on average about 14 inches off the ground, which you see very often, but sometimes we see it a little bit higher up than that. But you see these 2 birds very often nesting in Palo Verdes. So let's go into basically the identification and of the Foothills Palo Verde and its characteristics. When it is just young and coming out of the ground, it has abundant leaf umbrage. And this abundant leaf formation really is taking advantage of gathering as much light and as much photosynthate as possible, as quick as possible. And very quickly, by the second year, the plant has a chlorophyll in the stems. And through the first 4 or 5 years of the plant spends most of its time as green stems and very little of its time having leaves. It's estimated in the life of the Palo Verde, the Foothills Palo Verde, that over 80% of the photosynthate is captured by chlorophyll in the stems rather than in the leaves. Foothills Palo Verde is also known as little leaf Palo Verde because it has very small leaves. And these leaves are attached directly to the branch, to the leaf branch. And it also has a thorn, which is at the end of each of the branches, each of the stems. Thorns, of course, are modified stems. It's easy to tell the difference between a Foothills Palo Verde and a Blue Palo Verde simply by going to the end of a stem and feeling it with your thumb. And if you feel a thorn, it's a Foothills Palo Verde. And if it's just a nub, it's a Blue Palo Verde. Blue Palo Verdes don't have thorns on the ends of the stems, but they do have spines, and spines are modified leaves, and you'll find them along the axis of the branches. And so this is a quick and dirty way to tell the difference between Foothills Palo Verde and Blue Palo Verde. The leaves of the Blue Palo Verde are also clustered. The Foothills Palo Verde has a beautiful light yellow flower from a distance, whereas the blue is dark yellow. And the flowering of the Foothills Palo Verde, at least in the Tucson and Phoenix area, typically starts about mid-April and goes into about the 10th of May, whereas the Blue Palo Verde starts towards the end of March and overlaps with the flowering of the Foothills Palo Verde. The reason the Foothill Palo Verde flowers appear such light yellow is because the petals, the wing petals are yellow, they're light yellow, but the keel petal is white. And this, of course, comes together to make a very light colored, it's a very beautiful appearance. The pods of the Foothill Palo Verde are very characteristic because the pod clings to the seed. And so you can see the shape of the seed through the pod. The seeds themselves, referring to Sue Rutman's talk just now, have a very peculiar shape. They are ovoid and they look like little footballs. I'm sure Sue will have this in her collection. But the interesting thing about Foothill Palo Verde is that, yes, it has sexual propagation through the seeds, but it also has asexual propagation via root tissue. And here you see a cut in the side of a hill, and the root exposed, and a young plant growing up out of the root. And this is an attachment of the young plant at the root itself. This facilitates healing of erosion, because when we do have extreme weather and extreme rain, we do get erosion ruts that form in the desert. And Foothill Palo Verdes quickly shoot out these young plants from their exposed roots, and these roots eventually help to capture litter and debris from future erosion. And this gradually heals erosion ruts in the desert. It's a pretty amazing process. By the way, the root propagation is what nurserymen use to propagate hybrid plants. Let's see, like Desert Museum Palo Verde, which are basically clones, because it can't be produced by seed, so they use root techniques. The constant tissue shedding of Foothill Palo Verde is probably this tree's most important contribution to the Sonoran Desert system, because through this tissue shedding, it modifies the texture of the soil and increases dramatically the permeability of rainwater into the soil. But the Palo Verde does this in a very clever way. The tissue shedding happens on a regular basis through the leaves, and the leaves drop in periods of stress. Not quite as dramatically as the ocotillo, but the leaves can be put on 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, depending on cycles of wet and dry. And the pods and the seeds are shed when the seed ripens, and typically they drop directly down. They're not carried by wind or other mechanisms. They don't go far, but of course they're carried during the rains by washing down slopes. The twigs are shed when there's a little bit of stress, and then when there's more stress, branches are shed. First small branches and then large branches. And even more stress, entire trunks are shed under severe stress. And finally, if you have a megadrought that is prolonged, basically the entire trees can collapse. But this is a good thing, because not all the trees collapse in a population, only some do. And this is a way for the population to thin itself out and to make better use and efficient use of the water that's available. So Palo Verdes have a smart way to die. And basically they partition their dying of tissue. So here's a case where you can see twigs have been partitioned and are dying. You've got a main stem that's coming up in front of you, and off to your right, you have a small twig that has been partitioned and it's dying, but the main stem is not. And if you look at the base real carefully, there is an abscission layer there. And that means that this dying tissue is completely partitioned off from the live tissue, as the branch is that's going off to the left. There's an abscission layer, and there's a very clear difference between the live tissue and the dead tissue, the dying tissue. And this is an example of what happens as the plant is under the mega stress that we had over the last months. You see there are twigs that have died, there are branches, and then there are entire trunks. Whereas this is a blue Palo Verde, and blue Palo Verde doesn't have this mechanism of partitioning its dying. And basically when the whole thing starts to senesce, it senesces all together. And this tree, I took about a month before it finally collapsed. And this year we also saw a lot of mesquites that completely collapsed to the mega drought that we had recently. And these plants are unable to partition their dying process as the Foothill Palo Verdes. And I think it's important to mention that the ironwood has this exact same ability to partition its dying off, so that the whole tree doesn't die, but it sheds bit by bit depending on the severity of the drought. And I'd like to just highlight 2 examples of how ongoing Native Plant Society conservation efforts are restoring Foothill Palo Verde and Saguaro communities. And the first was a total surprise for us. We have, since 2010, on Ironwood Forest National Monument, you see the picture on the left where there's a BLM intern doing the last spray of a huge buffelgrass patch just below the summit of Waterman Peak. On the right, this is a slope. We call it the buffelgrass patch out of hell, and it's a 10-acre infestation of buffelgrass laced with teddy bear cholla and loose scree. And this is in the ragged top. And then on the below picture, this is our effort on the summit of a mountain that we have undertaken since 2016, whereby volunteers are taking out all of the buffelgrass above the road, 23 acres. In all three of these contexts, independently, 2 years after we take out the canopy of buffelgrass, what do we see? We see Palo Verdes are popping up all over. Once you have the buffelgrass canopy and shading and the competition for moisture taken away from the equation, these Palo Verdes, we don't even need to seed them. The seed is lurking and up they come. And it is just delightful to watch. And systematically, about 2 years after we start seeing the appearance of Palo Verdes. And this is quite motivating for the volunteers. And then the second instance is that on the Waterman restoration site, we have hand planted and succeeded in getting over 1,000 Palo Verdes growing, and all of them just rain fed. None of them have been irrigated or watered. Some of them now, after 10 years, are over 7 feet tall. But years ago, we had permission from BLM as non-Native Americans to harvest Saguaro seed on the monument. And so we had the great idea to go out and harvest seed, when it was ripe and falling off around the 4th of July. And for years and years, we took the seed and we planted it under the Palo Verdes in the restoration site. After all that effort, we have one single baby saguaro that has emerged. And it's not even under a Palo Verde. It's under a brittle bush plant. And so we know that this is going to have to be a 3-generation project if we keep going at this rate. And so this year in August, Native Plant Society partnered with Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society, whereby the Succulent Society will give us Arizona Native Plants and BLM little saguaros that have been rescued through their various rescue operations. And this started in just September, 2 months ago, and we started transplanting these rescued saguaros on the north side of the Palo Verde nurse plants. And now we have 22 young Palo Verde trees in the Waterman site that are now saguaro nurses. That's it. And I'm sure I am finished quite early. Are there any questions?
Thank you, John. Yes, we're totally good on time. We do not have any questions yet, so please enter those in the chat. You have John's undivided attention for at least the next 5 minutes, if not more. He's a wealth of information. So, all right, here we go. I've heard that saguaro seed germination rate increases significantly after passing through the digestive tract of a dove. I wonder how the collection of seed.
Lisa, can you slow down?
Oh,
I didn't quite catch that.
Okay, yeah, it's a long one. So I've heard that saguaro seed germination rate increases significantly after passing through the digestive tract of a dove. I wonder how the collection of seed affects the germination rate. So any thoughts on that?
I really don't know. I really don't know. I do know that when we collect seed, we collect freshly fallen fruit that have freshly fallen off the trees, we have to get out there quickly after a storm that has blown off the fruit because we have to compete with the rodents. And so I'm sure there's, I don't know if rodents destroy the seed or if it passes through their track too, but there's a lot of rodents that eat a lot of saguaro seed as well. I don't know about the doves.
Okay, and so do you think that's a very important step in the germination, that actually passing through the digestive tract
I
of some
don't
sort of
know.
animal?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that the fact that you have a lot of seeds that germinate under Palo Verdes, it's very likely that they're coming in on doves and birds and being pooped out. I mean, that's very, very feasible. So I could see that that's quite feasible.
Okay. Another question? What is the mortality of transplanted saguaros? And a second question: how long are saguaro seeds viable?
Okay, now we don't know. We don't have enough experience from the transplanted saguaros, but from potted saguaros, where they have a good root formation, we expect close to 100% survival. But of course, we treat these transplantings very, very carefully, and we dig out rocks underneath the plants that would obstruct the growth of the saguaros.
Okay. And audience, we still have time for questions, so feel free to type those in. And so, John, just a question I'll ask. So, in what you presented about the differences between the Foothills Palo Verde and the Blue Palo Verde, and the survival of them, if someone's wanting to add one to their own yard, if they live where they can be grown, do you recommend a Foothills Palo Verde over a Blue Palo Verde?
It kind of depends on the situation in your yard. I mean, if you're looking for a drought hardy plant that you're not going to need to water very often, for sure, Foothills would do the trick. And especially if you have any kind of a slope in your yard, Foothills really thrive on slopes. I mean, looking at the results after the Megadrought this summer in Tucson, certainly the Foothills Palo Verdes held up remarkably better than the blues to the drought that we had.
Okay, and then besides the Foothills Palo Verde, are there any other plants that you would recommend to someone if they do incorporate a saguaro into their yard, especially a young one, that you think would be a great plant to plant as the companion plant to help provide that shade and nurturing?
And very often we see wolfberries in association with Palo Verdes. They seem to thrive together. And so I would say that a wolfberry would be a nice addition for a Palo Verde saguaro assemblage.
Okay. And we've got what I think is a good question. Is something I've been wondering, so I'm glad someone asked. What is your opinion of the Desert Museum Palo Verde hybrid?
I think it's probably a good parking lot tree because it's easy to trim up. It doesn't require a lot of trimming. It's easy to balance, and it's handsome. It certainly doesn't form any pods, and that's a big plus for maintenance, especially in a parking lot situation. It's not as hardy as the Foothills Palo Verde. That's about all I have to say about that. As an ornamental, I think it's pretty good.
Okay. And does it still provide some decent benefits to wildlife if that's kind of a main reason someone's wanting to incorporate
Well,
a native
it's
plant?
got a very sparse canopy, and so birds would like to nest in it because it's not dense enough. And also underneath it, there's a lot of light that goes underneath it. And of course, you're not going to want a lot of litter in a landscape situation anyway.
Okay, and we got a couple more questions. So we know the benefits of the Palo Verde to the saguaro. So the question is there a reciprocal benefit from the saguaro to the Palo Verde?
That's a good question. I do know that when saguaros die, their carcass rots, and we have seen the germination of plants along the perimeter of those dying carcasses. I guess to some extent that could be a reciprocal, but that's a very, very good question. Yeah.
Okay, well that came in from Valerie, so we can thank her for that. And then going back to the topic of hybrids, so someone asks, do you know if the hybrid would or would not escape into non-urbanized habitat?
Well, it's like I said, the hybrids are basically propagated by the root. Okay, they're not sexually propagated, and so they don't make viable seed, and so there's no way that the seed can go anyplace. It doesn't travel, and the only way for the plant to go anyplace would be for a plant to come up via an exposed root, which is highly unlikely. So I would say that in terms of a hybrid Palo Verde going feral, the probability is about 0.
Okay, well that's good to know. All right, and I'll just do one last call for questions. We can still take them if anyone thought of one and has time to type that in. We'll just give it a few more seconds to see if we get any more questions. Okay, yes, John, with the rich diversity of the Waterman site, this is more of a comment. I look forward to your observations of other plant relationships there. So have you noticed any thus far, or is something maybe now you can be on the lookout for?
I mean, we're starting to see pretty systematically like I said, the association of the wolfberry next to Palo Verde trees and ironwood trees. We're seeing a wonderful succession of triangle leaf burr sage coming in and taking over from brittlebush, which is more of a pioneering plant than a permanent top level subbrush.
Okay, and we do have another question. Do you know why the Foothill Palo Verde prefers slopes? And what side, as in north facing or south facing?
Well, I've been told by geologists, and maybe I don't understand this right, but on a lot of our slopes, you have fractured rock underneath them. And so this fractured rock actually holds a lot of moisture. And so I would suspect that Palo Verdes are able to exploit that moisture very effectively and efficiently in fractured rock. And certainly we see this in saguaros when we see saguaros on ledges along practically sheer cliffs, and they're growing and doing very, very well. And the two of them seem to exploit very well the situation where you have lots of rock and gravel. Now, as far as exposures go, of course, south slope is typically you get your greatest populations, but we do see saguaro Palo Verde on the east and north and west slope as well, just depending on basically how steep the slopes are and how much light penetration is coming through. I've been quite surprised that they're not limited to one exposure or another, although the south certainly gets the densest stands.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you to everyone for submitting your questions.